Hey students, welcome to the Chapter 3 review for The Great Gatsby. Um, all of these reviews are just compiled summaries from SparkNotes, so you're always welcome to go to SparkNotes yourself and read them, but I kind of put them in a narrative format in these videos. And also am adding in kind of my own commentary. Additionally, if you go to the presentation version of these videos, you can watch the YouTube clips that show the Leonardo DiCaprio version movie of these scenes. And so you can check all that stuff out on your own. But I'm going to go ahead and get started and talk to you about Chapter 3. So one of the reasons that Gatsby has become so famous around New York is that he throws elaborate parties every weekend. Can you imagine how expensive that would be? At his mansion. Lavish spectacles to which people long to be invited. One day, Gatsby's chauffeur brings Nick an invitation to one of these parties. At the appointed time, Nick makes a short walk to Gatsby's house and joins the festivities. Feeling somewhat out of place amid the throng of jubilant strangers. Jubilant means like very festive. Guests mill around exchanging rumors about their host. No one seems to know the truth about Gatsby's wealth or personal history. Nick runs into Jordan Baker, whose friend Lucille speculates that Gatsby was a German spy during the war. Nick also hears that Gatsby is a graduate of Oxford and that he once killed a man in cold blood. So this scene might remind you a little bit of a previous scene with Catherine, Myrtle's sister, where she gossips about things she's heard about Gatsby. And so ultimately people love to gossip about Gatsby, which seems a little unfair. They go to his house, they enjoy his parties, they eat his food, they drink his drinks, they dance to his music, they make a mess of his property, and then they talk about him behind his back. But also, it's because Gatsby is such a mysterious figure. People have never seen him, despite being to his house multiple times for parties. They don't know anything about where his wealth comes from, but he is clearly very wealthy because he can throw all these parties. And they also just don't know anything about his past. And so that gives people kind of reason to gossip because they just can't help themselves. Now, Nick, however, he actually gets invited to one of these parties. And so the question is why? And there's a lot of questions in here. Why is Gatsby throwing these parties every weekend if he's not attending them himself? And why does he invite Nick to come? And so those are questions that we might have as readers when reading Chapter 3. All right, so what are the three primary rumors told about Gatsby at the party? So the three primary rumors are that he was a German spy during the war, that he killed a man in cold blood, and that he's a graduate from Oxford. And so these are really sweeping rumors. A spy, an Oxford graduate, a murderer. So we clearly don't know who Gatsby is. And so that creates a lot of mystery around him. And so Gatsby's party is almost unbelievably luxurious. Guests marvel over his Rolls Royce, which is a type of fancy car in the 1920s, his swimming pool, his beach, his crates of fresh oranges and lemons, buffet tents in the gardens overflowing with a feast, and a live orchestra playing under the stars. Liquor flows freely and the crowd grows rowdier and louder as more and more guests get drunk. In this atmosphere of opulence and revelry, Nick and Jordan, curious about their host, set out to find Gatsby. Instead, they run into a middle-aged man with huge owl-eyed spectacles, whom Nick dubs Owl Eyes, who sits poring over the unread books in Gatsby's library. And so, these parties are really, really wild. And this might again remind you of Chapter 2, where there is a much smaller version, another party where Nick gets very, very drunk, and so do the other party goers. And again, here we see people getting very drunk and eating a lot and partying a lot and essentially practicing what we would call hedonist behavior, in which they just consume and consume and consume. And now Nick and Jordan, they go off to try to find Gatsby. They go on a little adventure. Of course, they don't find Gatsby, but they do meet another character called Owl Eyes, who is kind of hanging out in Gatsby's library, and Owl Eyes is very drunk, but he's talking about how Gatsby is some genius, and looking at all of his books. And so that's the scene. And so the questions are, what is the explanation for Owl Eye's odd behavior? The explanation is he's very drunk, just like everyone else at the party. And why is Owl Eyes surprised that the books are real in Gatsby's library? And so it's the idea that Owl Eyes feels as though there's something fake going on here. Gatsby's throwing these parties but not attending them. There's something very fake. Something's not quite right. And so when Owl Eyes sees that the books are real, he's very impressed, but also a little confused because why have all of this knowledge located in this house that's only used for parties? Something doesn't quite mesh up. There's something not quite right. And it adds to the mystery of Gatsby. Why does Gatsby throw these parties? Why does Gatsby have a library filled with these amazing books? But I think also this speaks to a larger theme in the book about the 1920s. So the 1920s is known as the Roaring Twenties, and Fitzgerald is criticizing the Roaring Twenties. He's criticizing He's criticizing the kind of excess of the decade. He is criticizing how superficial the 20s seemed. And so the idea that the books would be fake goes into this idea that there's no real substance to the 1920s. It was just about spending and consuming, and there was no kind of like soul to the time period. And so we see that in this scene where Owl Eyes is surprised that there's actually any kind of thought behind this Gatsby character. And that ultimately goes into Fitzgerald's criticism of the 1920s and what he thought was wrong with them. So at midnight, Nick and Jordan go outside to watch the entertainment. Fireworks. They sit at a table with a handsome young man who says that Nick looks familiar to him. They realize that they served in the same division during the war. The man introduces himself as none other than, what? Jay Gatsby. Gatsby's speech is elaborate and formal, and he has a habit of calling everyone old sport. As the party progresses, Nick becomes increasingly fascinated with Gatsby. He notices that Gatsby does not drink, and that he keeps himself separate from the party, standing alone on the marble steps, watching his guests in silence. And so after all of this mystery is developed in chapter 3, it's just piled on and piled on. Who is Gatsby? What is he all about? Then Gatsby just kind of like comes out of the shadows out of nowhere. Nick has a conversation with him before he even realizes who he's having a conversation with. And so he's surprised. He's like, oh, you're Gatsby. And the thing is, that's really interesting, is that he vaguely knows Gatsby because they served in the same division during the war. And so they have this connection in their past, which might suggest why Nick so quickly trusts Gatsby and takes such a sudden liking to him, because they share a bond of war. And the war is part of the reason why Nick is in New York to begin with. Nick grew up in the Midwest, the quiet Midwest, and then went to fight in World War I. And when he came back, kind of World War I left him dissatisfied and restless, and he couldn't go back to just living in the Midwest again. So he went out to New York, arguably to kind of distract himself from what he experienced in war. And so by meeting someone else, Gatsby, who also fought in World War I, it makes sense that they would become immediate friends because they've shared something traumatic in the past that they both are kind of trying to escape. An interesting side note is that Tom, our antagonist in the book, did not fight in World War I. He got out of it. And so that's a difference between our three primary male characters, is that Gatsby and Nick did fight in World War I and Tom did not. I mean, Fitzgerald clearly has an opinion about that. And so Nick finally meets Gatsby. Gatsby is very formal, very put together. He says things like old sport. And it's supposed to be slightly indicated that he's putting on airs, that he's pretending to be this kind of very fancy man, but that it almost seems pretend. It doesn't seem quite right. And that would make sense for new money. Gatsby didn't grow up with money, and so he had to learn these behaviors because it's not who he was when he was younger. And it's interesting and mysterious that he doesn't drink and he doesn't party with his guests. He just watches them. A little weird. So why does he do that? So let's consider the following quote about Gatsby. He had one of those rare smiles with a quality of eternal reassurance in it that you may come across 4 or 5 times in life. So what does this tell us about Gatsby? So it tells us that there's something very charming about him. First off, he has a smile that you can't resist. But Nick also describes it of having eternal reassurance. So eternal means everlasting. It lasts forever. And reassurance means kind of comforting. And so Gatsby's smile provides an everlasting source of comfort, and it's incredibly rare. Only come across it 4 or 5 times. And so this suggests that when Nick meets Gatsby, he immediately is comforted by him and immediately trusts him and is immediately taken by him. And so remember, Nick is our narrator, but is he reliable or unreliable? So he clearly very immediately likes Gatsby. Do we trust the fact that he likes Gatsby? Do we rely upon this and say, yeah, Gatsby sounds like a really great guy? Or do we see Nick as being unreliable and say, well, what do we really know about this Gatsby? Can he be trusted this quickly? And so you as the reader, you get to decide. All right, at 2 o'clock in the morning, as husbands and wives argue over whether to leave, a butler tells Jordan that Gatsby would like to see her. Jordan emerges from her meeting with Gatsby saying that she has just learned something extraordinary. Nick says goodbye to Gatsby, who goes inside to take a phone call from Philadelphia. Nick starts to walk home. On his way, he sees Owl Eyes struggling to get his car out of a ditch. Owl Eyes and another man climb out of the wrecked automobile, and Owl Eyes truculently declares that he washes his hands of the whole business. And so essentially at the end of the chapter, Jordan and Gatsby have a private conversation that leaves Jordan shocked, and she wants to tell Nick what she's learned, but she promised that she wouldn't, so she doesn't tell him. She keeps her word to Gatsby, and she goes off and leaves. And then Nick decides to head home after a night of drinking. He kind of stumbles on home, and he sees Owl Eyes has tried to drive drunk and has crashed his car and is climbing out of his crashed automobile that's turned over in a ditch and has declared that he's had enough. And so the night is essentially supposed to have ended in shambles. People are a mess. They're fighting, they're crashing their cars, they're stumbling. It's a disaster. And again, this goes into Fitzgerald's kind of criticism of the 1920s and just how much of a disaster he felt like it was, that people were overindulging and that it was dangerous. And we see that it is dangerous. I mean, a car has been crashed into a ditch. Somebody could have died, and luckily no one didn't. But it kind of foreshadows this idea that this reckless behavior is very dangerous and that something really bad could happen. And so we get a slight sense of foreboding here. So based upon Nick's description of the events at Gatsby's party, are the attendees meant to be seen by readers as admirable or embarrassing? And it's the latter. It's embarrassing. At the beginning of the parties, maybe they were kind of conducting themselves in ways that kind of like were, cool. But by the end of the party, they're so sloppy that they're embarrassing themselves. And that is it for chapter 3. Hope that this review helped you out, and I will see you for chapter 4. Bye.